Okay, so what we're going to do in lesson 5 is we're going to start adding in sound files and song files, which is kind of exciting because most of your games have some very distinctive songs or sounds that go along with them. And you'll kind of see how this works in monogame. So the first thing we're going to focus on is adding sound files. What I need you to do is go to my classroom website. If you click on snare, and then if you click on this button here, it will download it into your downloads folder. So that's what I need you to do first. All right, then from here, once you have that sound downloaded, what I need to see is that you've created a program called Unit 6 Lesson 5 Sounds. So again, you can pause this video, go make that, and then we'll proceed on. Okay, so at this point, I'm assuming that you've downloaded the snare sound and that you've downloaded or that you've opened up this program and started at Unit 6 Lesson 5-Sounds. So similar to when we have fonts, you need to go into monogames. And we're actually going to bring this sound in through the pipeline. So what I need you to do is connect this to your program. So File, Open. Remember, you click on your name, Visual Studio 15, Projects, this first project or whatever Unit 5, Lesson 5 sounds. Click Open, go here, click on Content, click on Content.monogame pipeline. And then that should link to your program, and you should be able to check it right here. You can see Unit 6, Lesson 5 sounds. Now from here, if you right-click and you add existing item, you'll be able to go and look for your sound. And the reason we do this in here is because we can rebuild the sound and make sure it works. So I know mine is in my downloads folder, and there I can see snare is ready to go. So I click on snare, I open it up, I click copy the file to the directory and press OK. And then I can see it's been added in. So now if I right click and I select rebuild, I give it some time and I can see that the build was successful. So then I come into my program and I right click on content and I do add existing item. In content folder, if I make sure I can view all the files, I can add the snare in. So now that snare sound has been added to my program. So from here, if we want to use sounds similar to when we wanted to use random numbers, we need to add something to the very beginning of our program. So you'll need to do this anytime you want to use an audio.wav sound. And this will only work if we have a WAV file. So we have Microsoft.xna.framework and then audio. So audio is saying we're going to bring in WAV files and use WAV files throughout our program. Now, similar to the projects we've done in the past, audio files or WAV files are going to need an object to hold them. Now, the nice thing about sounds is they don't have to be displayed on your screen, so you won't need something like a vector2 or a rectangle, but you do need to actually bring that into your program. So this is called a sound effect object, because it's a sound effect in the game. So you're going to create a sound effect object. I'm going to call this snare. So this is an object that holds .wav files, and this one specifically is holding the snare sound. That's what's happening here. And remember, this line of code we added in so we can use the audio methods and objects. So that was built in there. So then from here, similar to before, we need to actually load in this song via the load content method. So if you go down to the load content method, we're going to add this sound in. And here we're going to say, okay, well, our snare sound, that's what we called it. So it's called our snare sound effect, is equal to, and very similar to before, this .content.load. The only difference is here we're doing a sound effect object, and then it's going to have snare, and you can put .wav, but here I believe it's best if you don't. So just leave it as snare. It matches over here. We're good to go. So here, this is holding the sound to be used. So we just have snare, and we're having a sound effect object. So remember, we don't need to initialize anything like we did previously because this sound doesn't need to be displayed. It just needs to be able to be used on the screen. So here we're going to add in the code to play this to the screen. And the code is actually pretty simple. And we're going to use the gamepad to do this. So let's do gamepad state object. We're going to call it pad1 is equal to gamepad.getState, and we're going to use player index.1. So we got that gamepad in there, and what we're going to do is we're going to say, okay, if, let's do the B button. So if pad1.buttons.b. If that is equal to button state.pressed, well then what I want to happen is I want the snare to play. And this is pretty easy to actually code in here. It's as simple as snare dot play with empty parameter. So this is a built-in, don't need a name, I'm sorry. This is a built-in method of a sound effect object, and it will play the sound once. So currently we have this set up where it's going to play the snare sound once. So now if I press start, it won't be playing, but listen very, very carefully to what is happening. So if I press start and I hold the B button for different amounts of time, it plays it, but it's playing it really, really fast. So what's happening is the current way that we have this set up is that it's going to play every time B is being pressed, every 60th of a second. And if we want it to just play once when we press it, like a beat, we need to actually have some button detection in here. So this ties into the other day. So remember previously when we had talked about button detection, we created two Boolean values, and we're going to do the same thing here. So we're going to create something called B pressed, and that's going to be equal to false to start, and that's going to be a Boolean value. So this is going to detect when B is pressed, and then we're going to create a Boolean called B released, and that's going to be equal to false to start as well, and this detects when B was pressed but is now released. So I'm going to use these down here. Instead of playing the snare drum when the button is pressed, what I'm going to do instead is I'm going to say, okay, when that button is pressed, I'm going to change B pressed to be equal to true. So I'm changing my conditional here, and it's saying looking for B pressed. And then if B is pressed, B pressed is equal to true. Then from here, I need to do a second thing. I need to say, okay, that's all great and dandy if B was pressed, but if B was pressed, that's equal to true. And now we notice that pad1.buttons.b is equal to button state.released. If that's what's happening now. So the button was pressed, but is now released. So B was pressed and is now released. What we want to note is that B released is now equal to true. So essentially what's happened is we looked for B was pressed. Now B was pressed and B was released. So we can now note, okay, B pressed is equal to true and B released is equal to true. So what's happened is B was pressed and now B was released. We can see that right here. And what we want to happen now is now we actually want the snare to play using its play method. So remember, this is built into the sound effect object, and we can play that sound. And then when this is done, we want to make sure that it waits for another button press. We're going to reset B pressed to false and B released to false. So notice all the extra code that went in if we just want to hear that snare play once. So now if I press play, what you will notice is I just get one. It doesn't play at 60 times per second as I hold the button. It just plays one time. So what you're going to do is you're going to go in, you're going to add in a couple of extra sounds and kind of make what sounds like a band with multiple instruments where each button represents a specific sound. So now that you know how to add sound effect objects, go use them and experiment with them a little bit more.